In this edition of Kid Lead, we're going to introduce the 6 ways that schools tend to hinder leadership development in students. Now, if you're a parent of a 3 to 18-year-old, we want you to become an advocate. If you're an educator, we're going to affirm you, but we also want to let you know that many ways schools tend to actually hinder the development of young leaders. We want to help you nix the 6 in this edition. Let me begin by saying I want to affirm educators. I believe in formal education. Our 3 sons have been homeschooled, public schooled, and private schooled. So whatever's best for the child, I believe in. 2 of our sons have received 3 master's degrees from USC and Duke University, and our youngest son starts his graduate degree this fall. Now, I'm not bragging, well, maybe just a little bit, but I'm basically letting you know that I believe in formal education. I teach in graduate and undergraduate programs at Naval Postgraduate School, USC, and in the past I've taught at UCI and Pepperdine, and so I am a believer in formal education. But at the same time, we need to be honest about our ability and our current status in how it hinders young leader development. So we're going to share with you 6 principles of why that is. And hopefully by bringing an awareness, it will help parents to advocate for their child's leadership development. And also it'll help hopefully educators get a better idea from a perspective of young leader development, how they can improve. The first way we hinder young leader development is because of our culture of compliance. Now, much of this is out of necessity because basically we work on an economic model of education. Public education is relatively new to society. It's a social construct that allows millions of people to be educated, but because we educate in mass, a teacher, to get things done, has to have a modicum of control. Therefore, we require them to be quiet, to sit still, to do this and do that and not do other things. The problem is that by nature, leaders tend to be non-compliant. What makes them unique is that many times they stand up and stick out and speak up. This will give them great salaries later on in their career, but in school time, it tends to cause them to shut down. So just the fact that we need this sort of culture of control and compliance for so many to learn makes it difficult for us to, at the same time, develop these young leaders to think for themselves and to stand up and to speak up. A second way that schools hinder leadership development is a misunderstanding of what leadership is all about. Now that's understandable because most educators have studied pedagogy. That's the practice and the study of teaching so people learn. And most people who study leadership don't work with kids. Therefore, when we talk about leadership at a young level, many times we refer to things like self-esteem, self-actualization, character, service. All of these are great qualities, but they typically don't distinguish what leaders do differently than others. It's not unique to them. In fact, most of the literature that I've reviewed on people 18 and below, the words leadership does not reference organizational leadership, things that most books for leaders or courses we teach on leadership actually focus on. Therefore, it's important for us to understand what leadership actually is and what makes it unique if we're going to develop these young leaders. A common misperception is that students who are really good in school are leaders. I found that typically straight A students aren't the strongest leaders. Many of your leaders are B, C students, and some of them even nearly flunk out because they just don't seem to fit, and sometimes they haven't learned how to develop or to use their leadership in public ways. Therefore, if we really want to improve leadership in our schools, we need to have a better understanding of what leadership is and a better definition of what leaders do. Now, the first 2 hindrances sort of explain the underlying issues, the foundation of which it's difficult for young leaders to develop in school systems. But the next 4 have more to do with specific actions and specific things that perhaps we can change more readily. The third way that schools tend to hinder young leader development is we sometimes tend to label them as troublemakers. That's right. Many of your frequent flyers down to the principal's office are really budding CEOs. What they get penalized for in school is many times what they'll get rewarded for as they become adults. So what we want to do is understand that many times these non-compliant students who stick out and take attention away from the teacher are really just trying to express their gifting in leadership. In fact, the United States Department of Education actually acknowledges leadership as one of the gifts in gifted and talented education. The problem is we just don't develop it much. So make sure that you don't identify or label your young leaders as troublemakers, because in reality, they're just trying to express who they are, and although they need to be disciplined, they're not trying to take attention away from the teacher. They're just trying to use their gift. I have found in working with hundreds of schools now across the United States and also 6 other countries that about 75% of teachers really don't care for these troublemaker students, these young budding leaders. I've also found that about a quarter figure out that these are actually assets to their teaching. That if they make them allies instead of enemies, friends instead of foes, they can actually use their social influence to positively control the other students and to help them learn in the classroom. A fourth hindrance of leadership development in schools is a lack of opportunities to literally lead and to get experience leading. Because it is a culture of compliance, adults are primarily in charge. And sometimes we choose students for different roles, but it's not about organizing teams. It's no budget usually, and there's very little for them to do. Now, many schools say, well, we have a student government. But if you look at student governments, what these students typically do is they do activities like putting up posters on the wall for a pep rally or perhaps doing a little speech, but it's not about organizing events. I've also found that about 50% of students who get elected to student government really aren't leaders, they just tend to be popular. The reason being is that students many times don't understand the difference between a popular student and someone who can organize well and lead well. So the bottom line is that we, just because of the numbers, rarely take leadership development seriously and therefore don't provide many opportunities, percentage-wise, for these young leaders to really truly lead in an environment where they could influence their peers significantly. A fifth hindrance of leader development in schools is a limited interaction with experienced leaders and students. There are many people in our communities, in nonprofits, in companies, and government agencies who really understand the ins and outs of everyday leadership. Our ability to bring them into the schools to speak to these students gifted in leadership, or to get these leaders into the businesses of the organizations and actually watch what these leaders do, is a great opportunity for them to grow in their awareness. I've found that even very powerful organizational leaders will take the time out to make a connection if they know that their connection is not just with ordinary students, but students who've identified to be gifted in leadership. The reason, I think, is because they see themselves in that young student and they wish that they had those sort of resources when they were young. Some people say, well, we teach 21st century skills, but you see things like communication, creativity, collaboration, really that's a skill set for every employee today, not for leaders only. So my encouragement is to figure out how we can get those connections made so that they're safe, so that they're reliable, but also to give opportunities for the mentoring and to hear the stories of young leaders themselves. And a sixth hindrance of young leader development in schools is just a lack of curriculum, a lack of resources to invest in teaching and training. Again, I understand that the typical school day, there's very limited time after athletics and academics and arts to focus on things like leadership, even though it is recognized as a gift in gifted and talented education. But even then, having resources that we can use in, for example, student government development. As I've talked to dozens and dozens of student government people, representatives. Very few of them ever use text. Very few of them ever use specific training programs. That's why for the last decade, we've been investing so much in writing project-based training for organizational development skills and books and ways to teach both adults and students about leadership, because we know that was a big need. But the bottom line is sometimes it's just hard to find a budget or to find a place in the schedule and the calendar to do that. We understand that, and yet it is a big problem and a big hindrance. So how are we going to nix these 6? I found that typically education precedes motivation. So in this short video, my goal was to simply inform you of some of the common ways that schools and educational systems actually can thwart and hinder young leader development. If you're an educator, I'd encourage you to think about the ways we've discussed and how you can begin to stem that tide in your own school. But many times it comes down to parents to advocate for their own child, and it will often require you to figure out ways you can develop their leadership outside of these systems not designed to do that. Regardless, it's really important that we begin leadership development very young. Over the years, I've had the opportunity to write a lot of books. I love the process of coming up with an idea, doing some research, outlining, writing, editing, and then finally seeing it published. I've also read a lot of books, and I've learned there's a big difference between reading a book and writing a book. Someone once said that a child is a book to be read, not to be written. The idea is that instead of trying to make them into something they're not, our goal is to understand how they're wired and then to develop them. That makes a lot of sense, especially for young leaders. Thank you so much for joining us in this Kid Lead episode. I hope you'll continue to support the subscriptions and also to push the like, send it to your friends, let them know that we're here to help them to succeed in young leaders. As we like to say, if you want to change the world, focus on leaders. But if you want to change leaders, focus on them when they're young.